well, we're not totally illegitimate. You know, we've got some basis of a just cause there. And then one day, in the summer of '69, the question occurred to me because of some students who were challenging me. And I was trying to convince them that they thought everybody was for the communists, that was it. And I was convincing them they weren't right about that. Then I thought about it. All right, maybe they're not all for the communists. How many of them want to prolong this war to postpone a free election that might bring in the communists or any kind of resolution? How many of them want the war going? Or to put it the other way around, I ask myself, how many Vietnamese in the South now would rather see this war ended, whichever side won, for either side, and specifically rather see this war ended with U.S. out rather than continue it? And I gave the answer that I think anybody in that embassy or anybody, any military man that I knew who had ever thought about the problem would give, which was the huge majority wanted the war over and wanted us out. So I called. I'd never thought of that in those terms before because we never asked the question. There were no polls in this day, which in those days in Vietnam, which you do have now, showing, as you know, that 80% of the people want the war over. They want the U.S. out. Various times, there's various questions are asked, but you get up in the 60%, 70, 80 want it over.
Why have you not mentioned the criminal state of Israel?
Yeah.
Okay. Zionism.
Can't get every
involvement in these things.
Right? Okay. Shall I mention it right now? That's not the issue I'm facing right now. This war. Okay. We will not reduce our danger from terrorism and the terrorism in the world. We will not. While we continue to occupy Iraq and while we continue to support Israel occupation of the West Bank as a permanent thing. Those aspects of our foreign policy have to change if we're to reduce the war on terror. I don't know if you heard that, but I'll talk to him later about it. But to go on Iraq right now, if I may. So I called up a friend of mine. Listen, hey, just tell him, listen, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards, okay, and I'll address that issue. Tell him. Okay, I'll ignore it.
Think I don't know you people?
I called up my friend in the White House, Mort Halpern, who was working for Henry Kissinger. He was a deputy to Henry Kissinger. And I'd known him for years, and he worked on Vietnam. And I said, Mort, how many people do you think would like to see this war over, whichever side won? Let's say if the communists won. He said, about 80%. I said, what do you think your boss thinks, Henry Kissinger? He said, how can we do it?
About Zionism. Get his hands off me. Take his goddamn hands off me.
Get him out of here.
No, listen, no manhandling. Let's talk about it later.
Agent.
Keep talking.
Hey, listen, you're absolutely entitled to speak and to your views, but let's take turns, if you may.
Right.
Glad to have him speak after our venture. Okay. Okay, I said, what do you think your boss, Henry Kissinger, thinks? He said, I've never asked him the question, but I think it would be the same. About 80% of the people would want us out of there, even if it meant a communist victory, even though they were not communists. So I said, well, in that case, what right do we have to prolong this war by another day? And he said, well, that's a good question. I'll have to think about it, he said. The meaning it had for me was this. In the summer of '69, a little before I copied the Pentagon Papers, for another trigger that I mentioned the other day, meeting somebody who was going to prison, Randy Keeler, who was going to prison, to cast his whole vote, who was willing to sacrifice his career and his life and his freedom in order to do all that he could non-violently and truthfully to help end the war. So he sent me an example that showed me what I could do. But the urgency of it came to me just before that when I say I recognize two things that apply to this war. One, it's an unjust war. It's aggression. We really all know that. Most Americans know that. Two, we should be polling to confirm what these little polls do. In fact, on December 15th, I wish there was a question on the election. that they're going to have and make it a referendum, would you or would you not like to see U.S. troops out of this country within 6 months at the most? Exit polling would be very good on that. I think it'll confirm, and if it confirms what I think that most Iraqis who do not agree with the terrorism used by some Iraqis with the unjust killing do see our presence there as unjust and they want it out. And if so, what we are doing is unjustifiable homicide, which is murder. And when I saw it that way, in 1969, it reframed my attitude toward the war, toward getting out. It's one thing to say, how do we get out gracefully? How do we get out and meet these other aims, our alliances, our image, our credibility, whatever? That's one kind of question. The other question is, how fast do you stop murdering people? When is it right to stop a process of murder, a serial murder and mass murder? And of course that question isn't really answered in terms of months or years or weeks. You do what you can to stop that right now as much as possible. So I'll end by saying something that I said about at one point in the war in Vietnam, and you just have to change the names. Neither the people we have lost, the lives we have lost on those crosses out there, which are being referred to now by the president as a reason to send others to die and a reason to kill. They're not a legitimate reason. As I meant to say to the interviewer here who asked me in front of that field of crosses, are we in vain? As Cindy has said, if we prevent one extra cross from being added in the months and years ahead to that field of broken dreams, of course, everything we will have done will have been more than worth it and more than justified. But meanwhile, the idea that those crosses justify more killing is obscene. So I'm saying neither, and then we have up here, we've recognized that there are Iraqi victims. The president needs to be asked by some of the reporters here and by our representatives in Congress the following question. What's your best estimate of the number of people who will die as a result of American firepower in Iraq in the next 12 months? Let me tell you, I asked that question of Henry Kissinger in 1971. He didn't have an answer. I knew he didn't have an answer. I happen to know that. Well, let me say I'm morally certain that George Bush does not have an answer to that question. Not just that he won't answer it, he doesn't have an answer as to how many people, Americans, babies, women, children, and men who are resisting us, Iraqis, because we don't have the right to kill anybody in Iraq. So how many will die? He hasn't asked Rumsfeld for that. Rumsfeld has not asked the JCS. You can be sure of it. Because for all the systems analysis they've done, looking at the costs and the benefits and the pros and the cons and all that, they've answered all kinds of questions that they think are relevant to that, but they don't see that question of how many people, humans, not just enemy combatants, and not just American soldiers, how many people across the board will die. They haven't asked that because it's not relevant. We've got to make it relevant for them in the light of the following proposition. Enough Americans, this will keep going till enough Americans like us see beyond the pros and cons. There's a guy there who knows how to attract cameras, by the way. We'll see past the pros and the cons and the costs and the benefits to see the following proposition. Neither the lives we have lost nor the lives we've taken give Americans any right to decide by fire and air power who shall govern and who shall die in Iraq. Americans must stop killing Iraqis. And it's going to be a long way, but when it comes to ending this war, we will stay the course.
motorcade is going by.